To the left we have the LG C1, to the right we have the Samsung S95B, and today we're going to be talking about WOLED to the left versus QD-OLED to the right. I think this will be an excellent simulation for the LG C3 versus S90C comparison that will probably come later this year. And I want to start by talking about some of the things that people don't necessarily cover and the reviews when they just kind of broadly talk about these products. There are some major strengths and weaknesses of both, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a better idea as to which one will be better for you. So smack a like on this video because we're getting to the point right now. If you're someone that values full screen brightness, the Samsung S95B to the right with its QD-OLED technology is going to give you a better consistency overall than WOLED. As you see, it's really dim to the left. This is going to improve even further in 2023, the current year. The reason for this is because a hyper efficient EL structure, and basically all OLEDs are electroluminescence, EL. But when you have a lot more of a refinement going into the electrical current and you're really finding a way to optimize it to a point that they have to drive it up to 2000 nits, you're obviously going to see better full screen brightness than even what we have here on the S95B. And WOLED doesn't really seem to be doing that this year on the C3. Now the G3, as far as we've heard, is the only model receiving any real brightness updates. So you can expect there to be an even more disparaging difference than what we have right now. And I think that's going to concern a lot of people, especially if they start coming down to the same price point. It's going to get to a point where anytime there's full screen brightness, you're really going to have to pretty much primarily only pick the WOLED, or rather the QD-OLED to the right, because it's just better for that kind of usage. Purple on WOLED TVs look really bad. I've been saying it for years, but here is a clear example for you to see. They have a very cool nature to them, so it appears closer to the color blue than an actual purple. And this makes it look really just pale and not as good as it should look, versus something that actually looks the part. Now, I'll show you a real case example of this so you can see that this isn't just unique to maybe a color pattern. These colors translate to real-world experience. In the Spears and Munsell UHD benchmarking disc, you can clearly see the disparaging difference to the left that WOLED is providing versus to the right that the QD-OLED is giving you. There is a massive difference in terms of the output and the intensity of the color purple that you can see within this magenta-esque flower. And it has various shades of different kinds of pinks and purples to show you that when we were looking at that example, how the purples were cool, it's doing the same thing here in a real-world example. That means that any scene that sees these kinds of purples will be grossly affected to a massive degree. Doesn't matter whether you're watching TV shows, movies, anime, video gaming, it's all going to be affected because this affects the global color of the television. In English, all that basically means is that the color on the WOLED is really not going to be as intense as it should be overall for pretty much everything you watch. This color red is the perfect example that I have been saying for years that you'll experience as probably the biggest deal breaker with WOLED. So this color to the left that LG OLED is producing is called blood orange. It is not a real shade of red versus the actual shade of red we're getting on the QD-OLED to the right. This massive disparaging difference between the types of red is insane, and you can see it across the board on virtually everything with the color red. Now, sometimes the red looks really good and very strong and even comparable when you get to the darker shades, but the brighter shades of red on WOLED always fall apart, and it's particularly called a 100% red stimulus. Those always fall apart extremely fast. This is probably one of the better examples I can show you of what I'm talking about. So if you look to the left, you'll notice that it's pretty much closer to the color orange. It's pretty bright. It's a very hot shade in the background on the brick. But to the right, it's very rich, very refined, true actual red. And they're able to depict the differences between the multiple shades of red, where on LG, it's just kind of like you get a dark red, you get a blood orange red, and that's kind of like where the party stops. It's not as nuanced as you have here, or as variated, or varianced as you see here. However you say that. there's a bunch of different ways that you can see red on the QD-OLED is the point I'm making here, and you can clearly see it here. So that blood orange that we showed you in the last example still follows through into real world content. But again, it's not like red can never look good on the WOLED, which I'll show you an example. In this example, and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, you are clearly able to see the red now is richer on the WOLED than what we have on the QD-OLED, because algorithmic processing, maybe whatever the case may be, when it gets to a near black scene, almost black, the WOLED has this behavior I've noticed where algorithmically it tries to darken everything in the scene, but coincidentally and beneficially enough, the red is what sees the darkening as well. So the whole scene, every color in the scene gets darker with a darker scene. And we'll let this scene play out just so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. I mean, like that red right there is so much stronger on the WOLED than it is on the S95B, because Samsung's algorithmic choice, rather than go in and say, you know what, we're going to make everything darker, they're saying we're going to have everything be consistent and make sense across the board. And it's not like every example it's better, it's just in most cases that it does end up looking better on the WOLED in this near black scene. But I always go to this scene and find it so complicating, because, you know, confusing is the word there, because it's just like you can clearly see the red is so much more intense and it has the potential. So what happened, I don't really know, but maybe it's something they can figure out with better processing. Brightness is a massive theme this year, and you're not going to see that pretty much translated into a real gain unless they can get some sort of precision color mapping down. Because as you see to the left, the LG is doing a much better job on a light 20% window stimulus of green versus the Samsung S95B, where that green just appears more pale by comparison because they're trying to brighten everything up. And that's an algorithmic choice that processing can easily scale back on, but they don't do that. Now, again, this doesn't mean that it makes the television terrible, but it does take away from a form of accuracy when you aren't able to get as rich because the algorithm is trying to go in and artificially brighten things. However, when we look at a 100% window of green, you can clearly see that the more vibrant, eye-catching color then goes to the Samsung. So it's really like anytime there is a color that needs to be hit with 100% brightness, it's going to display that like nobody's business really well on the S95B. But when you get to colors that maybe could benefit from a lower color volume, less color intensity from, you know, or less brightness intensity to give you a different shade of color, that's where the Samsung has a bit of a problem, to say the least. And without an advanced color management system like we have on the LG, where you can go in and you can adjust the hue, the luminance, and the saturation independently, instead, Samsung opts for you adjusting just the red, green, and blue channels inside of the color management, which does not work at all. You end up with varying results, and I've noticed that, well, LG is just able, even though it's not as technically capable, it doesn't have a quantum dot material inside of its OLED, but it's still able to produce a really wonderful image because it has the processing and the tools built in to be able to help it keep up and stay more relevant. As you see, this is the LG C1, but it's still holding its own really well against a quantum dot OLED, a technology that will become ever increasingly more relevant as time goes on. Something miraculous happens with the color green on LG OLED. It might not be as accurate as I'm getting on the QD-OLED, but the vibrancy and the intensity to keep up is every bit as good as you have on the QD-OLED. And in fact, in many cases, one can say that it can get a little bit more intense in some aspects depending on the intensity of the brightness. So if you're watching a near black scene, for example, like now, if we recall what I was saying earlier, algorithmically, anytime a scene's near black, LG's algorithm dims everything down. But again, consequently, that means colors. This gives colors this super vibrant appeal that makes them look well beyond what a WOLED is capable of. So it's a bit of a bittersweet. This does tend to add in a bit more in the way of black crush, because black is a color that they are dimming as well, but the overall picture does see a huge benefit. So we're kind of seeing that here in the Spears and Munsell UHD benchmarking disc on this lizard here, where it's just more three-dimensional because all the black levels are being crushed down to be really dark to create that extra contrast that just does not exist on the Samsung, because algorithmically they're just going with the general native look, where LG is kind of stylizing it a little bit by adding that contrast or lifting that contrast to look a certain way. Now, of course, you can always adjust this and fix this. I found if you go into Advanced Contrast Enhancer and you open it up to low, for example, you're able to alleviate that and get those shadows back. But the problem is it comes at a massive expense to your color, so it's usually not worth it to do that. So I wish there was a point where we didn't have to really juggle around choosing black crush or like really muted diluted color. And I think that's also the next conversation we need to have. Brightness might not always be better, especially when we're talking about, you know, these particular televisions, because as you're seeing here, the S95B is going to be the brighter television, and QD-OLED is likely going to continue to be brighter than anything that LG creates and comes up with. So why not instead focus on color mapping and tone mapping the colors around the brightness that you have? Without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest win on WOLED to the left on the LG C1 is going to be the color blue. Yes, you can get brighter color, and right now my camera can't even keep up with how bright the blue is. Don't let it fool you. It's not blown out. I'll tell you when these things happen on camera. Also, an important note to keep in mind when we talk about what's showing up on camera: certain wavelengths of color are going to be a lot harder to record and capture on an image sensor and then put them on your display accurately. That is why you have to trust the personality or content creator who's talking to you about these things, because I can't tell you how easy it is for you to assume one's blown out and looks like garbage and the other one looks just fine, just for you to buy it and it's the total reverse. So again, honesty plays a role into that, but fortunately for you guys, you're watching the #1 brand in honesty, so you don't have to worry about that kind of nonsense. But be that as it may, it is overexposing a lot more over here than it should. We can always change those things, but it'll start messing with the results on what we see on the LG. But the point being is that the brightness is incredible on the S95B, so much so that it's overexposing and my camera can't capture it, right? As far as the LG, it's not as bright, so it can capture it a little bit better, but it's not going to necessarily matter because it's still a win when we talk about the color blue for the LG, and I want to show you what I'm talking about. If you look at this image and you look carefully at the blue in the leaf, you'll notice that there's so much more shade and gradation happening to the color blue that's giving it more shades of color than what you have on the Samsung S95B to the right. In fact, it looks as though it can't even hit those shades of color, and that, my friends, kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the algorithmic choice. When there's something dark, LG darkens everything up. We've got a black background, so it's a mostly black scene. So guess what's happening? Everything's darkening, and those colors look amazing. But when we get to blues, it really pulls out every little detail because it's not overexposing everything. The Samsung, while yes, the Samsung does a great job, and it is my favorite TV by far comparatively, it's still not as accurate. And when we say accurate, we're not talking the director's intent. The director doesn't matter, okay? We're talking about just generally how colors should look. I mean, you know when something looks overexposed and overly bright to where you can't see details. And that is what's happening on the Samsung S95B more often than not when you compare the color blues and things like that. If you'll notice, there's sharper lines gradating, right? We have it happening here, sharper lines that separate, and you can see every little tone, where on the Samsung, it's there, but it's faint, almost muted by comparison. It's not anywhere near as detailed, and you can see it around things, especially like the green outline on the feathers. Again, don't know how well you'll see it, but again, the green outline, you'll be able to see like it just looks better on the WOLED than it does on the S95B. And again, this is where that conversation of processing comes into play. Processing is going to be wildly important as we start talking about any kind of winner, because both are capable of doing fantastic things, but if LG can figure out their black crush issues, then they'll win. they'll win to a massive degree. But like if you see here, this is kind of one of those differences that won't go away. And I always, every time I get to the scene and the Spears and Munsell benchmarking disc, when we start talking about the color red, I always immediately say, well, LG just kind of has no chance in the world. Because if you look and you compare this, if you have a WOLED and maybe a QD-OLED and you're able to do this, test this out, pause it on this scene, and you'll see the amazing amount of red that shines through to the right on the Samsung S95B with QD-OLED technology, where again, WOLED is not doing that. Instead, WOLED is giving you a very dim shade of red. It's not going to be as appealing, and frankly, it looks off by comparison. It doesn't even look like the color red. It looks like an entirely different color, comparatively, important keyword there, to what we have on the Samsung S95B. And again, I'm sure with like maybe a lower tier television, the LG would pull ahead to a great degree, but it's just not happening like that here. And again, brightness being way too strong to capture on camera, so it does tend to blow those things out. Now, if all we're talking about is brightness, then there is no doubt that if you look across every single test window possible, Quantum.OLED just gets brighter. It is a fundamental fact, and LG, even on their G3, will not have a chance in the world of beating what Quantum.OLED provides. It is just too big of an opponent to take on, and they've got a very, very, very long way to go before they could ever come close to usurping what that benefit will offer you. And I think more people, especially if the price is right, are going to want something like what we have on the QD-OLED side of things versus not, if they like brightness. And I think no matter how hard LG tries, they're not going to be able to kind of usurp that, take that away, mitigate it into being nothing, and that's the takeaway here. Both have strengths, both have weaknesses, and hopefully this video helped cover them a little bit more. Of course, motion processing is an entirely different animal, one of which we'll dive fully into later this year, but I want to hear from you guys. What do you think would be the king based off of what you saw so far? If LG continues the way they've been going and they don't fix the things I've shown you in this video, and Samsung vice versa, who do you think will win and why? Let's talk about it down below. Thanks so much for watching, the #1 brand in honesty, and until the next video, I'll see you guys later.